Saint Scholastica of Nursia was born in Nursia around 480 Common Era, her twin being the more famous Benedict, who wrote his rule that is now the common rule for monasteries around the world. Scholastica and Benedict were born into a patrician family, and we know this because their home is across the street from the Roman administrative center. And the closer you were to the administrative center, the power, the more important your family was. And as children of a patrician family, they would have been well educated in philosophy, histories, reading and writing, of course. They would have also been educated in scripture and theology, being a Christian family. The tradition is that their mother died shortly after their birth, but that's a tradition. We don't historically know how accurate that is. But like her brother, she would have been well educated. Her brother leaves around 497 or 98 to go to Rome to study under a master. That's what sons of important patrician families would have done. There were no universities at this time. You were sent to an important master and you studied. And we know from Gregory the Great's Life of Benedict that within a year he was so disgusted by what he saw in Rome, he went up into the mountains and began his journey that is made famous in Gregory the Great's Life of Benedict. But Scholastica would have been stayed behind with her family, and she was well educated like her brother, as women of her class were expected to as a person of a particular position or power within society. She moved, we believe, to one of her father's estates outside of Nursia, probably not that far from home, where she gathered together some women to live with her in her community, to study, to read, to copy manuscripts. Women did. They would have opened up a school to educate children who did not have access to an education elsewhere. We know this because this was a tradition from earliest Christianity that women who founded home monasteries, women who went into the desert, even our desert mothers, archaeologists now see the evidence of that they actually did open up schools in the local village and spent a portion of their day educating the children before going back to their cell and continuing their monastic observance. Judaism and Christianity both just valued the education of children whenever possible. So they would have held a life in common together. They would have met for prayer. They would have had a rule. Now, this is a small R rule because every home church, every small monastery wrote or agreed upon a rule. It might have been written down that agreed when we would pray, when we would eat, who would take care of these tasks, who would take care of the children, just kind of agreeing upon the common lifestyle and probably a few values that the community wanted to hold up for subsequent generations that might join their community. Although most communities only lasted in these early years, 1 or 2 generations. The ones that are more famous are the ones that lasted for many generations. But Scholastica would have followed in those footsteps. She actually is probably much of a leader in continuing women's ascetical communities. She would have been very aware of empire. She grew up, as Benedict did, in a time when Arianism was sweeping northern Italy as well as other parts of the empire. Arius was a bishop who suggested that Jesus was not fully human and fully divine. That's really kind of a Greek question. Jews didn't really worry about how God does what God does. But the Greeks were splitting hairs and couldn't figure this one out. And Arius suggested, well, this Jesus of Nazareth, he was like a superhuman being, but he wasn't divinity. He wasn't God. And the Orthodox position, defended most famously by Bishop Athanasius in Northern Africa, said that yes, Jesus was fully human and fully divine. He was not divine with just the image of a body, as some monotheists, some groups decided upon, but in fact that he was fully human and fully divine. And that's where Benedict gets credited with popularizing the wearing of a cross. Christians did not wear crosses or crucifixes before around the time of Benedict, because people were scandalized over how he died. He popularizes wearing a cross as a sign of the Orthodox position and embracing how Jesus died, and then, of course, rose again from the dead. But Arianism was sweeping through the area, and Benedict and Scholastica would have stood over and against Arius's teachings. They also were very aware of empire. Of course, they lived across the street from where the Roman authorities lived in their town of Nursia. Empire, we have our famous emperors today. We have Putin and Assad. And really, empire is also embodied by international corporations who have no regard for local laws, local customs, and it's all about greed and money. I always tell my students when studying history, follow the money, follow the power. And that was just as much true back then as it is now. And the Roman Empire was a greedy organization. Of course, the emperors wanted more and more and more. But it was also a time of horrific environmental devastation. They witnessed this because the Roman Empire did not value restoring the environment unless it was financially important to them. If it made them money, then they would be willing to do that, which is where Benedictines become, I'm sorry, it's not Francis, it's Benedictines who are and Benedict who is the father of the environment, because Benedictines were renowned from early on for developing ways of farming and orcharding and vineyarding without destroying the environment, but restoring it as they go along. So she was a follower of Christ, looking at how that she could be serving empire serving the gospel and rejecting the bad values of empire. Nothing's ever all bad or all good, of course. But empire held that women and children had no value except how they could serve men. Of course, she's defined that. She embraced, as Benedict did, that creedal statement that's so important from Galatians. There is neither Greek nor Jew, slave nor free, male nor female, for all are one in Christ Jesus. That's what made Christianity in part so scandalous to the Roman Empire. Was not the stories and the witnesses of Jesus's resurrection. It was the fact that the Christians were leveling the playing ground, saying that slaves, lepers, women were on par with men, and men of the low class, there just was no class. And every time Christians tried to embody this to the best of their ability, it caused ripple effects all throughout the empire. Did not go over well with the authorities, the rulers of that time. And unfortunately, Christianity, when it becomes legalized, will start absorbing some of these empire values, which are not good. Because we start preaching imperially, we start making proclamations imperially, we start wearing fancy clothing and unusual hats and taking on the trappings of the emperor. Not the best thing that ever happened to Christianity, to be quite famous. They would have reached out to educate children and widows. They would have educated children at least in the basics of reading and writing and math, as well as catechism, of course, preparing them for the Christian faith. They would have extended care to those in need. And as I said, every community would have had their own rule, but we have no idea what Scholastica's rule might have been. She would have known of the desert tradition just as her famous brother did. It would be John Cassian and others who brought the stories of the desert mothers and fathers across the Mediterranean to what now we call southern France and to Italy. And those values would have been important to her. Scholastica is oftentimes, in reference to rejecting values of empire, the art from earliest times after her death created artwork that has a piece in one hand and a book in the other hand. And the dove is a good symbol of peace, whereas the book could have been a reference to a rule her community might have had. Of course, could have been her brother's rule, but it could also have been the Bible, or just maybe all two or three wrapped up in one. But there is artwork dedicated to her, showing how popular she was after her death to people around the empire, but especially in what we today, of course, call Italy. And you can see this artwork in a cave or cemetery outside of the town of Nursia, which still exists. It's still a very active, it's a town, it's not a city. Like her brother, Scholastica witnessed the invasion of barbarians, the compromising of the gospel. She had to have been a strong woman to stand up to these things, to stand up to poverty, to stand up to the degradation of women and children, to stand up to the barbarians, to stand up, and barbarians, by the way, were just Germanic people or Slavic people. They were considered barbarians because they didn't speak patrician Latin. That was the standard of the day. They spoke the precursor to German and whatever other languages. But of course, they're also the way they lived, the way they how they ate, the clothing they wore was foreign to the patrician class. That also made them barbarians. And we know from the rule that Benedict was determined to level the playing ground. Again, the creedal statement from Galatians. But it was also the fact that he took anyone in that he had a sense honestly wanted to follow the gospel, were willing to live under his rule, his teachings and guidance. And so he leveled the playing ground. And so he sent the patrician class out to prune vines and chase sheep and cattle and weed the garden and, handle all the manual labor. And those who came in illiterate or barely literate were to dedicate up to 7 hours a day to learn how to read and write so that they could be on par with their patricians, fellow brothers. And that the point was that they could be reading the same histories, the same philosophies, the early church fathers and mothers, that they'd all be able to, look each other in the eye as equals. Of course, he was also dealing with some unusual behavior, and it was on everyone's part. Scholastica most likely did something similar, again, because the histories reveal that women's ascetical communities took in illiterate women and, again, put them to work learning how to read and write. And those who were used to having servants and slaves were sent out to learn to do manual labor, baking the breads, weaving fabric, whatever it is the women were doing in that community. There's no reason to believe she didn't follow the tradition she would have received and heard about from other women, a women's tradition of monasticism, if you will. What has always made me curious is how did Scholastica come to be the sibling with deeper love? And how is it, or in what ways did Scholastica influence Benedict's writing of his rule? Because Benedict did not sit down one day and start at the prologue, verse 1, and work all the way through to the end and say the end and publish it. Of course, they didn't have publishing back then, but so I'm being silly. But he wrote and he cut and he added and he cut and he added over the years as he was dealing with members of his 12 different monasteries. His last one will be at Monte Cassino. But he spent years dealing with ornery, feisty, hurt, broken, sad people. And in all that learning, he started coming up with, what this works best. He cut out this, he added this, he cut it out that. We know that one of his influences was the Rule of the Master, which was very harsh and way too wordy. Benedict took what worked well and heaved out all the rest. Making his own rule really his own, but acknowledging the influence from the Rule of the Master. Benedict has a much more positive sense of humanity and our ability to change and grow. The Rule of the Master is very suspicious of human nature and is very sin, fault, got to beat things out of people kind of attitude. And although Benedict has a few lines in there that still make us cringe today, it was very mild compared to what he knew in his day. And we really know Benedict from his rule and from the life of Benedict by Gregory the Great in his dialogues. So we read in the life of Benedict, it's chapter 14, if you want to look it up, where Scholastica came down to visit Subiaco. So she's living around Nursia, and it would have been a many-day walk down to Cassino. And she met him at the bottom of the hill. They would have owned a house, meaning the monks, down at the bottom of the hill of Monte Cassino. Monte is a mountain. Benedict comes down, and they did this annually and spent the day. Gregory says a day spent in holy conversation. These are two human people. So yes, they might have talked about the things of God. They certainly might have talked about theology, some new writer they might have read, some speaker they might have heard. That would have been very reasonable. But they were also talking about family and extended family and what's the news from this part of the world and what's the news from that part of the world, and what communities are springing up here and there, and what communities are in trouble and might need their help. It would have been very human conversation, but Gregory was writing to inspire people. It's called hagiography, where the point is not to give us a complete biography of a person. The point is to pull out the best examples, kind of grow them a little bit in a creative way. My Irish foremothers would have certainly understood this tradition, to make it a point about how you could imitate the best of Benedict's life. Gregory was overseeing a city that was being destroyed by roving armies, and he was trying to give encouragement to his very discouraged flock. And so he writes this hagiography on Benedict, whom he never actually met. He just heard the stories and probably saw a copy of his rule when the monks were fleeing Cassino, when they were being driven out. He's writing a hagiography to encourage people. Historians though, have been going back and they've been looking at the life of Benedict, and they are pinpointing historical points where it is actually accurate. That doesn't mean we actually don't know the conversation between Benedict and these characters, but it's turning out that more of the life of Benedict at least has historical grounding. It's not just totally made up fiction at all. But in there, this chapter 14, Benedict and Scholastica are visiting. We're having this conversation, as I mentioned, and dusk is coming around, and Benedict announces he needs to get up and leave because he needs to hike back up to his abbey at the top of Monte Cassino. I've been to Monte Cassino. It is a minimum of 13 switchbacks, very tight switchbacks. I did it with stick shift. Oh my God, I can't believe I did it, but I did it with my mother in tow. She risked her life letting me drive a stick shift up that mountain, but we did it. But it is very, very steep. And so she challenges her brother to stay for more hours. He says, "No, sister, I need to leave." Because his rule says no monk is to be out from the monastery without the abbot's permission. Now, he happens to be the abbot. He could have given himself permission, but he was kind of a letter of the law kind of guy. And he says, "No, I have to leave. I have to get back to my monastery." I'm sure he's thinking he has to set a good example. And his sister won't accept that. So as the imagery goes, she puts her four arms down on the table, clasps her hands, bows her head, and starts praying. And all of a sudden, what was a sunny day, the clouds start rolling in, and heavy rain comes pouring down, drenching the ground, torrential rains. I've been in places, both in this country and elsewhere, where those torrential rains are very dangerous. And he can't go back up because the mud would have been so slick and so dangerous, he would have broken his neck if he tried to get back up. So he was forced to stay, and he chastised his sister, but they stayed, and they visited throughout the night. The next morning, he returns to his monastery. 3 days later, he's in his cell, praying, probably reading scripture, whatever, and he's looking out the window, and he sees a dove ascending into heaven, and he knows, this intuitive knowing, that his sister has died. It seems she knew her days were coming to an end, and she wanted more time with her brother. Why did God answer her prayer and not his? Because hers, Gregory the Great tells us, hers was the deeper love, not his. But she's buried in Monte Cassino, so apparently she did not return to her home in Nursia. And there are some colorful stories around the history of Benedict and Scholastica's bones. Most of them are still under the high altar in Monte Cassino. If ever you go to the up to Cassino and into the church, underneath the high altar is where the two of them are buried. Now, because of the bombing in World War II of Cassino, they are in a steel lined box within a coffin within a coffin. They are not going to ever be endangered again, the church has decided. But what kind of an impact did Scholastica have on her brother as he's writing this rule? As I said, he's cutting and adding and cutting and adding. I think there's a woman's touch there, and I don't mean that to sound sexist, but where he might have been a letter of the law kind of guy, she's pushing him for some grace and for some mercy, where he, gives strict mandates about excommunicating brothers who misbehave. Oh, but then send a wise elder to go talk to them, see if you can bring him back around. there are hints all the way through of a woman's touch. She probably got her hands on a copy of his Rule in Progress and made suggestions to him about where he's coming across as too bossy and too tough, and where the mercy of Christ might be the more appropriate thing. There are echoes, I believe, all throughout there. Scholars, and I'm thinking particularly of Albrecht Diem, a great German now teaching in America, a scholar on many things monastic. It is his contention that it is women who kept Benedict's rule alive, not men. And I'm thinking between 600 and 850, when Benedict of Anian starts collecting rules from all over the known empire. And in the end, he and the emperor decide that Benedict's rule should be the mandated rule. That doesn't mean they all immediately switched over, but in the end, he decided of all the rules, Benedict's was the most practical. But what Albrecht shows us is that women's communities after the time of Benedict had their rule. As I said, every community had a rule. Oftentimes they borrowed, really good ideas from the monastery down the road, or, somebody's cousin's monastery in another country. Liturgists do this all the time, typing and stealing and borrowing all the time when we hear something really good. But Albrecht and others started studying these rules and realized, although it doesn't say in the heading, the rule of Benedict, in essence, it's the rule of Benedict with a few local particularities, like a cultural custom of their country or a preferred way of celebrating a particular holy day here or there. But it's essentially the rule of Benedict. The women kept it alive until the time of Benedict of Anian, who's about, 800, somewhere right around there. There's a book out that I want to encourage you to look into if you're at all interested in learning more about Scholastica. And it's called The Lost Dialogue of Gregory the Great, The Life of Scholastica, by a marvelous Australian Benedictine by the name of Carmel Posa. She has studied Gregory's life of Benedict. She knows the tradition of early Christianity. It's called patristics. She shapes this dialogue using known historical facts of what was going on in Scholastica's area. She creates stories comparable to the stories that Gregory created. It's quite reasonable and quite plausible, but it's also creative. But she gives you an insight into, after her years of study and reflection, into what could have been Scholastica's actual life. Because again, we know the tradition of women's ascetical communities, and there's no reason to believe that Scholastica would have taken a left turn and done something totally different than all the women around her. She would have, she knew the tradition, she would have followed the tradition and shaped it according to her own local group. And so I therefore encourage you to get your hands on, if you're interested at all, Carmel Posa's great new book. It's just out just last month from Liturgical Press. That's June of 2024. It's not long. It's an easy read, and I encourage you to go there. Take care.